At the family BBQ, my son asked for a burger. My brother said, "Those are only for kids with a future." Everyone nodded. I quietly took our plates and left. At 11:55 p.m., he texted, "Remember, but now he is." I read it standing in my kitchen with my shoes still on, my keys still in my other hand, the porch light still burning behind me because I hadn't gotten around to turning it off. My son had been asleep for almost 2 hours. The apartment was quiet in the particular way apartments get quiet after 10, when the upstairs neighbors have stopped moving around and the street outside is thinned out to the occasional car. I set my keys on the counter. I did not answer right away. Instead, I filled the kettle and stood at the stove waiting for it to click, watching the little blue ring of gas flame do its work. And in that time, I thought about the sentence itself. Remember, but now he is. He'd stopped typing mid-thought, or maybe he hadn't. Maybe the ellipsis was the whole point. A threat with the shape cut out of the middle, so I'd have to fill it in myself. That was very like him. He'd always preferred the version of a thing where I did the work of being afraid. I poured the tea and carried it to the small table by the window, the one with the wobble I'd never fixed because I never had people over to notice it, and I read the rest of what he'd sent. Remember who guaranteed your business loan 5 years ago. Remember who believed in you when nobody else did. You owe me some respect after the way you walked out today. And if you think you can just take your kid and leave in front of everyone like that without a word, you're going to find out real fast how much of what you have you actually built yourself. I read it twice, then a third time, because there was something underneath the threat that I wanted to be sure I wasn't imagining. A kind of confidence he had no actual right to anymore. The confidence of a man who still believed the balance of power between us was exactly where he'd left it years ago. He didn't know it had moved. That was the whole of it, really. He was standing on ground that had shifted 14 months earlier, and nobody had told him because there had been no reason to tell him, because until tonight, there had been no reason for him to ask. I set the phone face down on the table, the way you set down a hand of cards you already know you're going to win, and I let myself go back over the afternoon in order, because I wanted to have it straight before I answered him. I wanted every detail lined up the way I'd learned to line up numbers before a client meeting, so that when I finally did respond, there would be nothing left for him to argue with. The barbecue had started the way it always started, which is to say with my brother already holding court before anyone else had finished parking. He had the grill going by one, tongs in one hand and a can of something in the other, a folding table set up beside him with 3 different marinades in plastic tubs like he was catering his own life. His wife had her phone out within the first 10 minutes, angling it at the food, at the yard, at him, narrating in that bright podcast voice she used for her page. Isn't this just the best? Nothing like family. My parents' backyard was the same as it had been for 20 years. The same crooked fence, the same maple throwing shade over half the lawn by mid-afternoon, the same plastic pitcher of sun tea sweating on the porch rail. My mother was inside most of the day working on the potato salad she made every single time, the one recipe she trusted, and my father drifted between the grill and his lawn chair with a beer he'd nurse for 4 hours without finishing. I'd brought my son because of course I'd brought my son, and he'd spent the first hour doing what 7-year-olds do at these things, chasing his cousins, getting grass stains on his knees, coming back to check in with me every 20 minutes like a small satellite returning to orbit. My brother's twin boys were there too, 9 years old, both of them in sneakers that had probably cost more than my son's entire fall wardrobe, the kind of shoes you buy when you've decided showing it is part of the point. My brother had opened a 3rd auto shop the month before and had not, as far as I could tell, discussed anything else since. He was telling my father and our cousin about the financing, how he'd structured the expansion, how the numbers were going to look by spring if the projections held, and there was a rhythm to it I recognized, the rhythm of a man performing competence for an audience he assumed would never check his math. My son came up beside me around 2:30, tugging my sleeve the way he did, and asked if he could have a burger. He asked my brother directly, because my brother was the one at the grill, and he asked politely, the way I'd taught him to ask for things, please and everything. My brother looked down at him, then he looked at me. Then his face did the thing I'd seen it do 100 times before at 100 family gatherings, that particular shift from neutral to something with an edge under it, pity wearing the mask of concern. "Those are only for kids with a future," he said, and he said it loud enough that it wasn't really meant for my son at all. It was meant for the yard. Kids whose parents can actually provide for them. The yard did the thing a yard does when something like that lands in it. The grill kept hissing. Somewhere, a car radio was still playing low from the driveway, but the conversation around us went quiet. That specific quiet where everyone suddenly finds something very interesting to look at that isn't you. My father looked at his shoes. My mother, who I found out later had been standing just inside the screen door with the potato salad bowl in her hands, didn't come out. My aunt, who'd claimed the good lawn chair early and hadn't moved from it all day, set her wine glass down on the little side table with a small definitive click. "He has a point, dear," she said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "You really should think about your son's future instead of that little apartment you're renting. When are you going to get serious about your career?" My uncle wandered over from the drinks table with the smile he always wore, right before he said something he considered generous. "My accountant was just telling me about some investment opportunities last week, real wealth-building strategies. It's never too late to start, though, if you wanted to make better choices going forward." My brother flipped another burger like he hadn't just detonated something in the middle of a family gathering, like the whole thing was already already behind him. Some people just don't have the entrepreneurial mindset, he said, mostly to our cousin now, though loud enough for the rest of us. Not everyone can run a successful business. Takes vision, dedication, real sacrifice. His wife laughed, that particular laugh she saved for whenever he said something cruel and clearly wanted an audience for it. My son's hand had tightened in mine sometime during all of this, and I could feel him working very hard not to cry in front of his cousins. I looked down at him, at the paper plate he was still holding out like it might yet be filled, and I made the only decision that felt like it belonged to me in that moment. I understand, I said, quiet, to no one in particular. I took the plate out of his hand and set it on the table. Come on, sweetheart, let's go home. But I'm hungry, he whispered. I know, we'll get something on the way. We walked toward the gate, my hand on his shoulder, and behind us I heard my brother call out, cheerful, performing all the way to the end. Don't forget the family investment meeting next week. Oh wait, that's only for people who actually contribute to the family business. More laughter. I didn't turn around. I got my son into the car, buckled him in, and by the time I'd pulled out of the driveway, he'd let the tears fall, the ones he'd been holding since the grill. Why doesn't my uncle like us? He asked. It's complicated, honey. Is it because we don't have a big house like his? I gripped the wheel and didn't answer that one directly, because I didn't have an answer a 7-year-old could use, and because the honest one involved things he was too young to carry. Uncle doesn't understand everything about our life, I said instead. That's okay. We stopped at a diner on the way home, one of the old chrome and vinyl places that serve breakfast at every hour, and I watched him order a burger with extra pickles like the whole afternoon had already stopped mattering to him. That's the mercy of being 7. He wiped ketchup off his chin partway through and told me it was better than the one he would have gotten anyway. Way better, he said, grinning. That smile made the whole drive worth it. I sat there in a booth that had seen better decades, drinking bad coffee, thinking about the 5 years that had led to this exact afternoon, about all the choices my family considered failures, about the late nights they knew nothing about, the calls with people in different time zones, the negotiations that happened in rooms none of them would ever see. They'd built an entire story about who I was out of an apartment and a job title they didn't understand, and none of them had ever once asked me to explain it. That night, after I put my son to bed, I sat in my small living room with a cup of tea and thought the day was over. It wasn't, not by a long way. 5 years earlier, I'd been sitting across a different kitchen table, my brother's this time, back when he still lived in the townhouse before the money really started coming in, and I'd asked him for help. I remember exactly how I'd rehearsed it in the car on the way over. I'd wanted to start a financial consulting practice, something built around the analytical work I'd been doing quietly for years, unpaid, for friends and friends of friends. The kind of thing people eventually start suggesting you charge for. I had a business plan. I had projections. I had, or thought I had, a case. He'd listened for about 4 minutes before he laughed. You? A consultant? He'd said it the way you'd say something absurd out loud just to hear how absurd it sounded. You barely graduated college. Who's going to take financial advice from you? I sat there and let it land. The way you learn to let things land when you're the younger sibling in a family that decided its hierarchy a long time ago and never revisited it. I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain the years of unpaid work, the client I'd already half lined up, the numbers I'd run 6 different ways to make sure the plan wasn't just Hope wearing a suit. I just asked him if he'd consider being my guarantor on the small business loan the bank required, since I didn't have the collateral or the credit history yet to qualify on my own. He said no. Then, over the following weeks, as I kept the door open without pushing it, he said no 3 more times, each no delivered with a slightly different flavor of doubt, until finally, at a Sunday dinner in front of our parents, he said yes in a way that was somehow worse than another no would have been. Fine, he'd said, waving a hand like he was doing me an enormous favor, which, in fairness, by his accounting, he was. I'll sign, but you're going to owe me for this, and when it doesn't work out, don't come crying to me. I signed the loan. He signed the guarantee. I opened the business in a spare room I converted into an office, with a desk I'd bought secondhand and a laptop that was already 2 years old, and I started building client relationships the slow way. One referral at a time, one report at a time, staying up most nights after my son went to bed because that was the only time the analytical work required real focus, and I didn't have any other hours to give it. What my brother didn't know, and what I never told him, was that the loan was paid off in full within 18 months. I'd made sure of it early, partly out of pride, and partly because I did not want to be one single day past due on anything with his name attached to it. I called the bank myself, confirmed the payoff, kept the letter. I never told him it was paid off. I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't kindness and it wasn't strategy exactly either. It was something closer to exhaustion. Telling him would have meant a conversation, and the conversation would have meant explaining the business, and explaining the business would have meant defending it, justifying it, proving it. All the things I'd already done once and had no desire to keep doing on a loop for the rest of my life. It was simpler to let him believe the debt was still live. It cost me nothing to let him have that, or so I thought at the time. What it actually cost me was 5 years of being reminded. He brought it up at holidays. He brought it up at my son's birthday parties, usually in a tone dressed up as concern. Something like, I just want to make sure you're keeping up with everything, given everything I put on the line for you. He brought it up to our parents when he wanted to make a point about who in the family had really stepped up for who. He brought it up, eventually, so often that it became less a fact and more a kind of background music in every room we shared, a hum I'd learned to tune out the way you tune out a refrigerator. I let him have it because I didn't think it mattered anymore. The loan was gone. The debt, in every way that counted on paper, didn't exist. What existed was a story he'd built for himself in which I owed him something permanent, something that didn't require a balance sheet, just his memory and his willingness to bring it up whenever he needed the room to remember whose favor he thought I was living inside of. I didn't correct the story because I didn't think the story had any real power left in it. I was wrong about that too, in the end, though not in the direction he expected. Yeah, there is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being the family's designated disappointment for half a decade, and it doesn't announce itself all at once. It accumulates. You absorb it in small increments at holidays and birthdays and the occasional Tuesday phone call, and each individual increment is survivable, forgettable even, until one day you look back and realize the increments added up to something with real weight. The Thanksgiving after I started the business, my brother stood up during the toast and thanked everyone at the table for their support that year. And when it got to me, he paused for just a beat too long, smiled, and said he supposed some of us were still finding our footing. Nobody laughed outright. Nobody needed to. The point had landed exactly where he'd aimed it. The following spring, at my son's 4th birthday party, held in the same small apartment I still lived in, my brother arrived 40 minutes late with a gift bag from a store I recognized as absurdly expensive for a 4-year-old. Something meant less for my son and more for the room, a demonstration piece. He handed it over with a flourish and told my son, loud enough for the adults to hear, that this was what a real birthday present looked like. My son, 4, had no idea what any of that meant and was simply delighted by the box. I was the only one in the room who understood the sentence had never actually been about him. There was the year my parents refinanced their house, right around the time my brother was expanding into his second shop. And though nobody ever explained the arrangement to me directly, I pieced it together the way you piece together things families don't discuss out loud. The equity had gone toward his expansion, structured as a private loan between him and our parents, secured against the house they'd owned outright for over a decade. I only learned the details of it much later, and only because I went looking, but at the time I remember my mother mentioning, almost in passing, that they'd taken out some paperwork to help your brother with the new location, and that it was the kind of thing family does for each other, wasn't it, when someone's really trying? Nobody had ever refinanced anything to help me trying. There was the summer he brought up the loan guarantee at a cookout that had nothing to do with money or business at all, in the middle of a conversation about someone's fence, apropos of absolutely nothing. Just a stray comment tossed into the air like he needed to remind the group, and me specifically, that the ledger between us was still open as far as he was concerned. I remember taking a sip of lemonade and saying nothing, because saying something would have meant explaining that the ledger had actually closed years earlier, and I still, at that point, could not make myself have that particular conversation. There was the Christmas he asked in front of the whole table whether I'd found any clients yet, in a tone that assumed the answer was no, that assumed my entire professional life since the loan had been a slow, quiet failure I was too proud to admit to. I had, by that point, 4 steady retainer clients and a growing referral pipeline, none of which he knew anything about because he had never once asked a question that suggested he actually wanted the answer. There was the afternoon I landed my first Fortune 500 retainer, a genuine milestone in the business, one I was quietly proud of in a way I didn't often let myself be proud of things, and I mentioned it briefly at a family dinner, not fishing for praise exactly, just wanting the fact to exist out loud in front of people who knew me. My brother had nodded, said that's nice, and pivoted within 11 seconds to a story about a supplier issue at his second shop that ended up occupying the rest of the meal. I remember counting the seconds afterward, in the car, the way you count something when you need proof later that it actually happened the way you think it happened. And there was, every single time, some version of the same undertone running beneath all of it, that whatever I had because of him. That the apartment, the modest life, the single-parent hours, all of it traced back to a version of me that existed before the loan, a version that had needed saving and had been saved, and that this fact entitled him to comment on my life indefinitely, the way a landlord comments on a property he still, in some sense, he'd never examined too closely, believed he owned a piece of. I let him believe it. I told myself it cost nothing. I told myself the truth would come out eventually, in a way that didn't require me to sit across from him and manage his reaction to it, and that when it did, I would rather it happen on my terms than in the middle of someone's toast. I did not expect the terms to arrive at a barbecue over a hamburger aimed at my son instead of me. That was the part I hadn't accounted for. He'd spent 5 years taking shots at me, and I'd absorbed all of it without much cost, because I'd built a life sturdy enough to take the hits. But my son was 7. My son had no such life built yet, no armor, nothing to absorb it with except the small confused hurt of not understanding why an adult he was supposed to trust had just told him in front of everyone that he didn't have a future. That was the thing that changed the math for me, not the years of comments about my apartment, not the recycled speech about entrepreneurial mindset. My son, holding out an empty paper plate, being told in front of a yard full of relatives that burgers were for kids whose parents could provide for them. I'd absorbed 5 years of it on my own account and called it fine. I was not going to sit there and let it start landing on him too. 14 months before that barbecue, I'd been sitting in a conference room in a city 3 hours from home, on the other side of a table from two men in suits that fit them the way suits only fit people who've stopped thinking about money entirely, reviewing the final terms of an acquisition. My investment group had been circling for the better part of a year. First National wasn't a large regional bank, not by the standards of the industry, but it was well-run, undervalued, and exactly the kind of institution my firm specialized in identifying. A bank whose books were healthier than its reputation, whose local footprint made it sticky with small business borrowers who'd never think to shop around, and whose previous ownership group was ready to exit for reasons that had nothing to do with the bank's actual performance and everything to do with an unrelated dispute among the sellers. I want to be clear that none of this had anything to do with my brother when it started. I didn't know, walking into that first meeting, that First National held any of his loans. I found that out roughly 6 weeks into due diligence, buried in a loan portfolio spreadsheet with several thousand other line items, his name appearing next to an auto repair business address I recognized instantly because I'd driven past it more times than I could count. I sat with that discovery for a long moment before I told anyone on my team. It felt, for a while, like something that should change the calculus of the deal, though I couldn't have told you exactly how. It didn't, in the end. The acquisition made sense on its own numbers, regardless of whose name happened to be attached to one commercial loan file out of several thousand, and I wasn't about to let a coincidence involving my brother steer a decision this size in either direction. We closed the deal. My firm structured me in as majority owner through a holding entity that didn't carry my name anywhere in its public filings, a standard structure for exactly this kind of acquisition. Nothing unusual, nothing designed around him specifically. What was true, and what I sat with privately in the weeks after closing, was this. My brother's business loans, all three of them by the time he'd opened his third shop, were now functionally mine. Not mine personally in some petty sense, not something I could reach into and manipulate on a whim, but mine in the sense that the institution extending him credit, setting his terms, monitoring his covenants, was an institution I now owned controlling interest in. If he ever missed a payment, ever tripped a covenant, ever needed the kind of grace period a bank sometimes extends to a longtime customer as a courtesy, the ultimate decision about whether to extend that grace ran, eventually, through channels that led back to me. I told no one in the family. There was no reason to. It would have meant explaining the acquisition, the fun, the structure, all of it, to people who still thought my apartment was the headline fact of my life. And I did not have the energy to relitigate my entire existence for an audience that had already decided the verdict years ago. I did, in one specific and deliberate way, instruct the loan servicing team not to flag his account for any special scrutiny, and not to extend him any unusual accommodation either. Standard treatment. The same treatment any other commercial borrower with his exact payment history would receive. I wanted, if I'm honest with myself now, to see what would happen to a version of him that existed without my quiet thumb on the scale in either direction. The version of him that had to live inside a normal commercial relationship with a bank that had no personal feelings about him at all. For over a year, nothing happened. He made his payments, mostly on time, occasionally a day or two late in a way that never triggered anything because the terms allowed for it. His third shop opened on schedule. He kept coming to family gatherings and reminding me, whenever the mood struck him, of the debt he believed I still owed him, the loan he thought was still live, the guarantee he thought still mattered. I let him keep believing it. It cost me nothing. I did not know, when I woke up that Saturday morning and packed a cooler for the barbecue, that the day would be the one where all of it finally came due. I didn't plan it. I want that understood clearly, because there's a version of this story where it sounds like I engineered the whole afternoon, waited for the perfect moment to spring a trap I'd been building for over a year. That isn't what happened. What happened was much simpler and much less deliberate than that. My brother, on an ordinary Saturday, chose to humiliate my son over a hamburger in front of the entire family, and then compounded it that night by threatening me over a debt that had stopped existing years before he ever brought it up. He picked the fight. He picked the terms of it too, without knowing what the terms actually were. I only picked the moment to tell him the truth. I sat at the little table with my tea going lukewarm and thought for a while about simply not answering him at all. It was a real option. I ran it out in my head the way I run out scenarios for clients, following each branch to its likely end. If I said nothing, he would probably escalate the tone of his texts over the following days, then eventually call, then eventually show up somewhere, my parents' house most likely, demanding that someone explain to him why I was ignoring a threat he clearly believed carried weight. My parents would call me, worried, asking me to just smooth things over, because that was the family's preferred solution to my brother's behavior. Had always been the preferred solution, smoothing rather than confronting. I would spend a week managing the fallout of silence instead of a single evening managing the fallout of the truth. Silence would cost more in the end. It usually does with him. I considered, too, a smaller response, something that pushed back without revealing anything. I actually drafted one, sitting there with the phone in my hand. I'm not interested in discussing this tonight. What happened today wasn't okay, and a threatening text at midnight doesn't change that. We can talk when you're ready to have an actual conversation about how you treated my son. I read it over twice. It was true, every word of it, and it would have felt, in the moment of sending it, like standing up for myself in exactly the way I should. But I could already see how it would play out. He would read it as an admission that I had nothing else to say, that the loan guarantee genuinely did still carry the weight he thought it carried, that I was simply asking for a delay because I had no actual answer to the debt he believed I owed him. It would not close anything. It would only push the same conversation to a different night, on the same terms, with him still standing on ground he believed was solid. I deleted the draft. There was a third option, the smallest one, which was simply an apology request stripped down to nothing. Please don't speak to my son that way again. That was true too, and reasonable, and it would have made me feel, for about 4 minutes, like the bigger person. But it left the actual leverage exactly where it had always been, in his hands, resting on a debt that no longer existed anywhere except in his memory of it. An apology extracted from a position of no power is not the same as an apology extracted from a position of real power, and I had, as of 14 months ago, real power sitting completely unused in a filing structure he didn't know existed. I looked at the 3 drafts stacked up in my head, none of them sent, none of them adequate, and understood that every version I could write from the position he assumed I was in would land the same way. Reasonable, ignorable, ultimately a delay tactic in his eyes rather than an answer. There was only one version of a response that would actually end the conversation on the first exchange, and it required telling him something I had kept to myself for over a year, something I had built no plan around ever revealing, certainly not like this, not over a threatening text at midnight after a birthday cake had gone uneaten, and my son had cried in the back seat of my car. But there is a difference between a truth you're saving for the right moment and a truth you're simply avoiding. And sitting there with his message glowing on the table, I understood I had been telling myself a story about the first one when the truth was closer to the second. I had not been waiting for the ideal moment. I had been avoiding a conversation I didn't want to have, the way you avoid a phone call you know is going to be long and complicated, until circumstances finally made the avoidance more expensive than the conversation itself. He had made avoidance more expensive tonight. That was in its own way the one genuinely useful thing he'd done all day. I looked at the clock, just past midnight. I thought briefly about calling the firm's counsel first, just to confirm there was nothing procedurally irregular about disclosing my ownership stake directly to a borrower who happened to be family, even though I already knew the answer, since ownership disclosure to an affected party isn't restricted the way some other things in banking are. I decided against it. This wasn't a legal question. It was just a hard conversation I'd been putting off, dressed up as something more complicated than it actually was. I opened my laptop. I pulled up the transfer documents first. The wire confirmations from closing, 14 months old now, the entity structure diagram my firm's counsel had prepared, the loan portfolio file that still had his name and his business address sitting in it, exactly where I'd found it during due diligence. 3 loan numbers, one for each shop, the third one opened just 8 months earlier when he'd expanded again. I checked the account status on all 3 before I wrote anything. The first 2 were current. The third, the newest one, financing the third shop, was 3 days past due on that month's payment, sitting exactly at the edge of the grace period our standard commercial terms allowed. I had not been tracking this personally. I want to be honest that I had to look it up in that moment, and that I felt something close to disbelief myself when I saw the date, because it meant the timing of everything, his midnight text, my discovery of his default, all of it had converged without any planning on my part at all. He had chosen tonight, of every night in 14 months, to remind me of a decade-old favor, on the exact week his newest loan sat unpaid past its due date. I typed the message slowly, checking each fact against the file open beside it, because I wanted nothing in it that could be argued with later. I appreciate you bringing up the loan guarantee from 5 years ago. I'm attaching the ownership transfer documents for First National Bank. As of 14 months ago, my investment firm acquired controlling interest in First National, which is the same bank currently holding all 3 of your business loans, including the loan on your third shop and the private refinance secured against mom and dad's house. Your account on the third shop loan is currently 3 days past due. The standard grace period ended as of tonight. You have 72 hours to bring the account current before we move to the next stage of our standard default process. That's not a threat. That's the same language in the loan agreement you signed. I hit send at 12:14 in the morning. The phone rang before I'd set my cup back down. What is this? He said. No hello. You own the bank? That's not possible. I'm a consultant, I said. I just never told you who my clients were because you never asked. You bought a bank, my bank, and didn't say anything for over a year. It's not personally my bank. It's an acquisition my firm made. It happened to include First National, which happened to include your loans. That's just where the numbers led. Bullshit. His wife's voice rose behind him. Something about a lawyer. You did this on purpose. This is about the burger thing. The burger thing, I repeated. The thing where you told my 7-year-old in front of the entire family that burgers were only for kids with a future. He didn't answer that directly. My father's voice cut in, muffled, saying, let's all just calm down. You could have called me, he said, quieter now, instead of a corporate letter at midnight. I did call you eventually. You called first. I only told you tonight because you texted me a thread about a debt that hasn't existed in 3.5 years. What do you mean it hasn't existed? I paid it off 18 months after you guaranteed it, in full. I never told you because every time I thought about it, I remembered how many dinners you'd already turned it into a referendum on my entire life. The silence went on long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then, you let me believe I still had that hanging over you. For years, you brought it up at Thanksgiving, at my son's birthday. birthday. Today, right before you told him he didn't have a future. I let you keep believing it because you never once asked me a direct question I could have answered honestly. This is insane, he said, though the conviction had thinned. You're the one who's been lying. I never lied. I just stopped correcting you. My mother's voice came through, tearful. Honey, can't we all just talk about this like a family? He didn't mean anything. He's just under pressure with the new shop. He told a 7-year-old he didn't have a future because his mother couldn't afford a hamburger. I said, I'm not interested in reframing that as pressure. You're being vindictive, my brother said. This is extortion. I know lawyers. Have them review the loan documents you signed. Your account has received better treatment than any other borrower with an identical payment history over the past 14 months because I instructed the servicing team not to flag it. That courtesy ends as of tonight. What do you want? He finally said. An apology? Fine. I'm sorry about the burger thing. Are we done? I want you to make your payment within 72 hours, the same as any other borrower in your position would be required to do. This is such bullshit, he said, but it had the sound of a man saying a thing because he needed to say something. 72 hours, I said. I'll let you go handle it. I hung up before he could answer. The phone buzzed twice more. I didn't look. I rinsed my cup and went to check on my son, asleep exactly the way I'd left him, one arm thrown over the edge of the bed. I stood in his doorway before I went to bed myself. By morning, there were 41 missed calls. I made pancakes because it was Sunday, and my son ate them at the counter in his pajamas, asking nothing about the phone lighting up face down beside the stove. At 9, a wire transfer came through against the third shop's loan. $12,800, full amount plus late fees, from an account I didn't recognize. I don't know where he found it on a Sunday morning. It didn't matter. The account was current again. 3 days later, a letter arrived by certified mail, an apology addressed to my son, worded with a formality that made it obvious someone other than my brother had drafted it. It said the right things in the right order. It did not sound like him. I put it in the drawer where I kept his old drawings. 2 weeks after that, at my mother's birthday dinner, the whole shape of the room had changed. My brother and his wife arrived on time, stayed exactly the length of the meal, left before dessert. Nobody brought up the loan. Nobody brought up my apartment or my career or my future. When my son asked quietly whether he could have a piece of cake, my brother cut him a slice himself, larger than anyone else's, and set it down without a word. Small victories. I noticed it. I didn't make anything of it out loud. That night, tucking my son into bed, he told me his uncle had been nicer today. I told him he had. He yawned and said he liked it better when people were nice to each other. I told him I liked that better too. My phone was still sitting face down on the counter where I'd left it that morning. I didn't turn it back over.